Twyla is the Vice President of Student Development at Trinity Bible College in North Dakota. As I said, she's also our speaker. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today, Twyla, and entering into this conversation. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and how God has got you to where you're at in this journey.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you guys today. I'm looking forward to being with you at Eastern Camp this summer and meeting some of you face to face. I love camp, and so I trust that that's going to be a great time of students encountering Jesus, and so really looking forward to connecting with you. But I started out in ministry as a youth pastor. I was actually a youth pastor at my home church, so I had kind of an unusual transition where my senior year of college, my youth pastor, said, "Hey, I'm resigning and you're going to be the next youth pastor." And so I went home to my small rural role, and I was DYD for almost 8 years. And then I ended up coming to Trinity, and kind of how that worked towards the end of my youth pastor years. I remember looking back at the last 8 years, and I was trying to kind of figure out in that last year, like, why did it seem that the students who were with me in the last half turned out so much better than the students who were with me in that first half? And some of it was just that I really didn't, know a lot in those first few years, but that's when I started really getting passionate about this subject of culture, because I realized that it had a lot more to do with our culture was way more established in that second half than it was when I first started. And so those kids kind of like turned out because the culture produced them. So I really got passionate about that subject. And so actually when the president of Trinity contacted me and we sat down, I said, well, here's the thing. I'm passionate about creating culture. And if this is what you're looking for, if this is the kind of person you're looking for, then I would love to come and do that at Trinity, and bring that into focus. And so that's really been a great joy here in the last 3 years, is to see the culture kind of defined and refined. And so I've been passionate about that ever since. I say when I started as a youth pastor, that I had, I'm a planner. So I don't know if any of you are planners. I know that's not as typical for youth and kids pastors, but I am a planner. And by the way, if I say student ministry, I'm talking about youth, kids, and college. The reason I use that term for all of them is because I'm in college ministry now, but I never want to have claimed to have left youth ministry. So I say student ministry for everything. So when I was a youth pastor, I started out, I was a planner. And so I had a very multi-point vision statement. Like, it had 3 main points and then a ton of sub-points. And I say that I had more points in my vision statement than I had students in my youth group. And that was actually true. And so I had this amazing vision statement, or I thought it was amazing. But, within a few months, that just kind of went in the garbage, when I realized that, like, wow, I'm just trying to like fill up this calendar and all that thing. And so by the end of that journey, when I say I realized that the kids had turned out, I started getting onto this subject of culture. And I love this quote by Disney. It says, "We teach participants how to create a culture by design rather than a culture by default." Mm-hmm. So I really felt like we had a culture by default when I was a youth pastor, but I knew in every ministry role going forward, I wanted to make sure that I did it more intentionally, that I was like taking what I learned accidentally and saying, now let's do it intentionally.
Yeah. So with your role at Trinity, are you in charge of shaping the culture at Trinity? Do you also like help as someone on the campus to teach students how to go out and create culture?
Yeah, my role encompasses basically all of the non-academic sides of their experience. So as vice president, I'm over student ministries, student life, and athletics, and chapel's included in there. Wow. So, I have department leaders under, those kind of things, but it really allows us to infuse culture in that way. And I'd say it's mostly our student leaders that I teach the culture stuff to, who then perpetuate that and understand that, because that's really our whole focus. So that word is used a lot here, but I'm not in the class. I am in the classroom for a little bit with freshmen, but I'm not in the classroom necessarily teaching on that. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Awesome. So today we want to talk to you obviously about creating culture in our ministries.
Yeah.
This is beyond youth. This is beyond kids. This is
Yes.
church encompassing. This is church body.
Yeah.
But today, obviously, with youth and kids leaders, we're going to focus on that. You mentioned after 8 years in ministry that you switched your focus to intentional culture. So how would you define what culture is?
Yeah. So in kind of the simplest form, but kind of a Webster's version, is the shared attitudes, beliefs, behaviors of any group of people. Okay. So those kind of like, obviously core, what do we believe? And then how do we behave because of what we believe? But to simplify that even more, I always say culture is simply the always and nevers, right? It's like what always defines us, what never defines us. And I use that illustration a lot. Like if I was to ask each person that's on this call, tell me about your family. Like what was the big deal to your family growing up? Most people can say, sports or not sports, or, music, fishing, whatever that is. There's usually some big deals. Or what are the things your mom and dad always said to you, and then, like, especially those of you who are parents, a lot of times you end up perpetuating that stuff, even though you didn't like think through, I'm going to reteach my kids this, you just automatically do it. Yeah. If you're in a family where your parents made you make your bed every day, and that was a really big deal, you probably have your kids make their bed every day, Yeah. And so those kind of always and nevers is the simplest way to define culture. And then I go on. Okay, so for those of you on video, I'm going to have you pay attention to the video for just a second. Those of you on audio, I'm holding up a Rubik's Cube. I'm going to hold up a Rubik's Cube in just a minute, okay? And no, not because I can solve one, because I'm not like that. Okay, but when I hold this up, I want you to just take a look at it, and I want you to count the green squares, okay? The green squares, I'm just going to hold up for a second, okay? There we go. Okay, so I hold that up for a second. Now, because there's not a lot of audio, Brian, I'm just going to ask you.
Yeah.
Okay, how many red squares were there?
I think I saw one.
Okay, wrong. There's two. Okay, okay.
I saw one. I just
yeah. Okay, you did see one. You're not like, okay. Here's the reason I use that as an illustration, because you weren't paying attention to the red because I didn't tell you that the red was important, right?
Right.
So the simplest way I define culture is saying we're teaching our youth and kids what's important.
Yeah. And
so we're saying this is what really matters to us in our church, in our family, or our youth ministry. And that's really what culture is, right? Growing up, it's like, this is what's important. This is what's not important.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good. I love that. I love that illustration and that filter.
Yeah.
I have a quote here on their notes from Elmore. Can you go over that?
Yeah. So Tim Elmore, I don't know how many of you are familiar with his stuff. He's one of my, youth men heroes, gurus. He's not actually in, youth or kids ministries, but he works a lot with colleges and with high school students, public students. If you've never heard of the books called Habitudes, I really encourage you to check those out. And he talks a lot about culture. So and I've had kidmin friends that have used the resources too. So this isn't just a youthman thing. So, but Tim Elmore talks a ton. He goes and he works with, high schools about how to create culture in your high school. And when he says this, culture offers us a lens with which we see things and a roadmap to an organization-wide definition of normal. So when I held up the Rubik's Cube, I was kind of saying, focus on what's important.
Yeah. And
I kind of say that culture puts a lens on our students, and it says by which they kind of filter the world, right? And says like, this is important, and this is also how you should see things. So a culture, we use that culture of honor term a lot in just in us. Nobody owns that term, but we use that because if I have a lens that says I treat people honorably according to the image of God in them, that affects what kind of text do I send to that 11-year-old girl who hurt me at school today? If I have a lens of honor, then and I'm not you know, we're not winning or losing if that 11-year-old sends a bad text. But even in my conversation with that young lady, let's say mom called me and said, you know, my kid's getting in trouble for bullying another girl, I'm going to use that language of the culture language that says, you know what, we honor that this other girl is created in the image of God, and we wouldn't treat God himself like that. So we're certainly not going to, you know, so that kind of like lens thing is a really big deal. So we're creating our definition of normal in our kids or youth ministries. You know, what's a normal when a kid walks into our kids church or into our youth ministry, you know, how are we treating each other? How are we doing that? Because that's normal for this organization. Yeah.
And so that's kind of jumping into the why culture, the
yeah.
why importance. Go ahead and expound on the why a little bit more for us.
Yeah. So part of the reason I think that, you know, we're just now seeing kind of a lot of books come out. It's kind of been in the business world for the last few years, but books in the church world are just kind of coming out. I think some of it's a response to the fact that culture is shifting, exterior culture, like let's call it secular culture, is shifting so quickly that we're never going to be able to create enough rules for our kids to memorize to know what to do in every situation, right? So I started in youth ministry in the year 2000. I could not even have imagined in the year 2000 that 12-year-olds were going to have point and click pornography in front of them in their, you know, they're going to have phones, you know, that have this access all the time, or that like that 11-year-old girl was going to be able to be bullied in her bedroom through, you know, Facebook Messenger or something like that, or Snapchat, you know, whatever that is. I couldn't have imagined that, right? And so when I'm a rules person, you know, so what I did when I was young in ministry, I don't know if you guys have all done this, but if somebody did something, I'd just create another rule, you know, like there was new rules for camp or new rules for youth convention, you know, because somebody did something. Well, I'm going to create a rule for that, you know? Yeah. And so, and I'm not against those rules, okay? But so let's say we have a rule, maybe when we take kids or youth to camp or retreat, that says girls and boys don't sit next to each other on a bus, okay? Mm-hmm. Whether you have that or you don't have that, I don't care. But that's a common rule to have, okay? So let's say we have that rule, which I'm not against that rule at all. But if all they know is a rule and don't understand the culture behind that, then when they're in other situations that we can't even imagine the type of situations they'll be placed in, that doesn't, you know, does that rule teach me, oh, and I also shouldn't snap pictures of my naked self to this person? You know what I mean? Like there's something greater. But if the culture is, we honor each other enough to protect each other's purity, and this is why we don't sit by each other here, and we do that in every area, then the rule has now become a filter, right, for society. Right. So just because our world is changing so fast, we can be the best youth and kids pastors in the world. We still won't be able to teach them all the rules they need to navigate, because they're having challenges. They will face challenges that we can't, it's not in our paradigm yet, you know? Right. So that's why I also say, I don't know, when you, Brian, were you taught phonics growing up?
Yeah.
Phonics? Yeah, like how to sound out words, okay? Yes. So one of my friends, and this happened with my brother too, some schools stopped teaching phonics. Mm-hmm. So one of my friends I remember studying with in college, she would only know whatever words she had memorized, right? So when a new word came along, she was hopeless. Like she couldn't sound it out, you know? And so, but with phonics, it teaches you how to sound out. You can encounter a new word. So I believe what culture does is it teaches our kids how to sound out their culture, or how to sound out what they're going to face in the future. Right. So it's not just the sight words. Like, I know not to say bad words. Okay. Right. Well, what if other words get invented that mean the same thing, you know? But that's not on the list of words my youth pastors said I couldn't say. So that's what I love about culture, is we're saying, if we have these things established in our youth or kids ministry, it's teaching them for the long term, how to face the new challenges.
And I like that it's this, if in a sports mindset, I
Yeah,
love that culture helps you a lot defensively,
sure.
but I think when it comes to like ministry growth, it helps you
Yeah,
just as much offensively.
that's
I
true.
think I think we've spent time talking about the nevers, but to go back over to the
Yes,
always, I
the
feel like
always.
the always are the non-negotiable values.
Yes.
Like we're
Yep.
going to focus on these values.
Yes.
And there's other values that are good,
Yeah.
but we can't spread ourselves too thin. So to define our culture, we're going to have these non-negotiables, these always, these values that this is
Yes.
who we are. And I think it absolutely helps them respond to the negative part of
Yeah.
the world. But I think it's also just as equal to help them respond to bringing the positive into the negative,
That's
bringing
an
the hope into
excellent.
the,
Yep.
you
Yep.
know. And so I love that this is all both
Here,
sides.
so here's an example of that. So one of our core values, core culture values, which I had as a DYD, carried into here, is that every student has a call of God on their life,
Yeah,
right? But that call may be to be a teacher, maybe to be a business person, maybe, but there's a call of God, and that call means that you are called to take part in the mission of God and impact some realm of society or culture, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so that call may be a stay-at-home mom or dad, you know, whatever that may be, or maybe a call to vocational ministry, right?
Yeah.
But it is a huge key for us. And so I see that, like what you're saying, that's one of the proactive things. And
Yeah.
one of my favorite moments was that in one of our business classes, actually, an intro to business class, the teacher told our students, and one of the students who had been raised in our camps and youth conventions when I was a DYD, and he said, now most of you have probably heard that only people going into missions or full-time ministry are called of God. How many of you grew up, knowing that? A bunch of the class raised your hand, and one of the girls said, that's not what Twyla taught us. Twyla taught us that every calling is valid, and that we can be called. And that was a culture win, right? Because that wasn't I remember Twyla preaching a sermon. That was we always said, respond to the call of God. So I love what you said. It's a very much the proactive, not just the
Absolutely.
reactive. Yeah.
Absolutely. It gives your students a mission as much as a response.
Yes, exactly. Great.
So would you share some insights from your experience on how we can best create culture in our ministry? Because it can be daunting. What do
Sure.
how do I do this? So in your
Sure.
experience, give us the how culture
Yeah.
part.
The first thing I would say is if you have a healthy church, okay, like I think that's pretty key. If you have a healthy church, youth and kids, you're not trying to do things that aren't the values of what we would call big church, right? Like you're trying to still holistic. This is holistic. So if you're a kids pastor and you have a youth pastor and a lead pastor, or you're a youth pastor, you have a kids pastor, I encourage you to brainstorm with them and say, like, let's talk. And even though it might be tweaked a little bit and how you say things, whatever, it should still be really holistic values. But if you have a healthy church and you're saying, man, we're doing some things right, let's work to define that so that we can do it more intentionally together.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is the first thing. And that's what I did, in our church. Towards the end of my youth pastor career, I was like, wait, let's, my lead pastor, when I talked to him about this, he said, why don't you sit down and define, since I had been raised in the church, what are these things that actually, what were our always and nevers? What were the core values that were a big deal to us? So I think the first step is really, before this gets really daunting, just say, like, what are some things that define us? What are the big deals, in our church? And it might be, generosity is a really big deal in our church, or understanding that everybody has a role in ministry, everybody serves, whatever those are. I mean, they're really different. Like you said, you can't do everything, right? So it's going to look different. But really just looking at holistically, what already do we have?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe what are some things we need to, maybe we're not real strong here. Maybe our church doesn't have a great family atmosphere yet, but we want that.
Yeah.
Then we can still establish that,
Yeah.
and then say, okay, family, the sense of family is going to be a core core part of our culture, but we're going to have to work a little bit harder on that, you know. But there's three things specifically I talk about when I talk to student ministry leaders about creating culture. And that's simply these three things: speak the culture, celebrate the culture, and model the culture. I think that's the most simple way to define it. I'm really passionate, doing some graduate work right now about speak the culture, about the language that defines culture. Because we, our rhetoric, you know, the types of things we say, you know, you can say, Mom always said, you know, somebody else jumped off a bridge. Would you jump off a bridge? You know what I mean? Like those kind of like things. And so what we say gets repeated and actually gets deep into the DNA of those that we lead. Yeah. So memorable phrases. So not just the words that define their culture right now, but even within those, okay, what is a memorable phrase? Or I actually use metaphor and stories sometimes too. Yeah. That if any of you listen to Andy Stanley, you know how he pulls everything down to kind of 1 point, you know, takeaways, because he says memorable is portable. So when it comes to culture, I actually want there to be things that students repeat, you know, like my youth pastor, my kids pastor always said this.
Right.
And so speak the culture, I think, is a huge thing. Then celebrate the culture. You know, we can accidentally celebrate the wrong things, you know, if we're not intentional. So if, for example, and Brian, you know, didn't ask me to plug this, but if BGMC and Speed the Light is a really big deal, are we celebrating that? And I don't even just necessarily mean like giving somebody a trophy, you know, but are we celebrating the testimonies? Are we allowing a kid, you know, in kids' church who did their own car wash for BGMC, are we allowing them to tell their testimony? You know, that helps establish a culture of generosity because we're rewarding with attention the things that we value. Right. I am all for like cool events and surprises and things like that, but we actually need to be predictable in terms of our value, our language, our responses as leaders, you know. You know, any kid that comes home from school and isn't sure if there will be supper that night is in an unhealthy environment, right? So predictable is very healthy, you know. It teaches it teaches a culture. So I love establishing traditions, whether it's like rites of passage type things or just general, like every year we do this, or, you know, I love that kind of stuff, because that's really how the culture of our families when we were raised. You know, I was just talking to a friend the other day about what they did for Easter. You know, did your parents do Easter baskets, or did your, you know, whatever. All those little kind of things actually establish culture. So modeling is really the always and nevers and the traditions that we develop.
Right. I'm going to take a second and just try to add to what you just said.
Go ahead.
And I shared with you before we opened the lines up that our church as a whole is, we just finished our Recalibrate cohort with Troy Jones, pastor of New Life Church in Renton, Washington. But he taught a lot of this as well. And that speak the culture in his book of Recalibrate is, I think, worded common language, create a common language.
Yes.
And so it's awesome that we get to walk through this with you, but this is something that we've been walking through as a church, and so it's been something that I've been trying to model in my youth ministry. So I started looking at YouTubers. Kids are into YouTubers. A lot of us probably listen to podcasts. A lot of the younger kids in video game in that world, they have the Twitch streamers.
Yeah.
All of those successful channels, whether it's a podcast, a YouTube, or a Twitch stream, have that common language that they do. And so we started opening our youth group with the same phrases. Hey, we're a culture of family, growth, and honor.
Yes.
We say, hey, it's not coincidence that you're here, that God actually knew you were going to be here tonight. And so there's things that we say when we start every service.
Excellent.
And we'll even notice at all of our network events, our superintendent, Bill Wilson, he always has a theme for the year. And this year is pursue, if I'm not mistaken. And I think last year's was bold. But every event that we go to, event, Bill Wilson will reinforce that. That's a common language. To go back to like celebrating the culture, one of the things that we've been doing is obviously we want a culture where kids experience God. And I
Yes.
think celebrating the culture, celebrating wins, our church vocabulary would say share a testimony, right?
Yeah.
All of us know that when we share testimonies, it's a win. But when we do that, it builds our faith, right? It creates that excitement. Like if God can do it for him, he can do it for me. And so
exactly.
I think that celebrating the culture, it's great that we put this stuff into words, but this is stuff that the church has been doing. We just don't always do it intentionally.
Yes, exactly.
Modeling the culture is obviously great. So this is I just wanted to add to what you said. I'm not really.
I totally agree that a lot of it, we can, and that's what I did as a youth pastor. I looked back and I said, hey, what did I accidentally do right in these last 4 years that I didn't do in the first 4 years?
Right.
So it wasn't like, I don't think like a lot of us are doing this stuff unintentionally, but like you just said, now that you realize it, now you're doing it intentionally. Wait, I'm going to start every youth service the same, because it also assures our students that when they bring a visitor, they can rely on this.
Yep.
But then they're going to repeat that. Those are the takeaways, the DNA, long after the message or cool illustration or whatever that is. So that's great.
And honestly, from a kids pastor, youth pastor standpoint, this makes our job easier because it's actually less to prepare every week.
Totally.
When you already know how you're going to open your service.
Yes.
You already know how you're going to close your service. You already, and it just, the reinforcement is incredible. But from like a preparation standpoint, this helps me a ton.
It does.
I already know what we're going into. So I thought I had one more idea that I was going to share on that, but it slipped my mind. Okay. So we have some questions. While that's not in my mind right now, we have some questions that have been coming in, and we're going to go to the chat. And we'll start with Ben. He said, question: if I set the always and nevers for my ministry, do those change over time as different kids and families join our ministry? And how often do you release the culture of your ministry?
Sure. I guess in my experience, because it's been I've kind of done this 8-year thing everywhere I've gone. I haven't changed it, but I think that if your church, especially if you have a leadership turnover in your lead pastor, if that vision changes, then I think that would be a significant time to reevaluate what's the big deal. Because you might have a new leader come in who says, actually that's not the, like we're going to be 90% evangelism focused, or, whatever that is. And so I'm going to have to adapt those. I don't really adapt them based on the type of people, unless there would be, again, a significant shift that happened within the church, maybe some kind of new industry comes into town and the type of people that we had are totally different, but otherwise I think that we should pick the things whatever, the things that really we feel like God has called us to do as a church, So one of the things I did in a rural community, I was in a strange rural community in the sense that there were a lot of other evangelical churches. So we were a small town, but we still had like 5-6 youth pastors. And I kind of was like, Holy Spirit, why do you have us here? Like, what is our unique? I know we're together, we're evangelism. And I realized that like, oh, wow, we're the only Pentecostal one though. And so I need to make sure that encounter factor is a really big deal, because that's what we're believing and offering that other people aren't. And so to me, that always and never was never going to change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, first of all, Craig Rochelle just released a podcast, I think last week, that actually touches on this.
Sure.
When to change those values, which, he said on his level, I mean, I don't know how many campuses he has.
Yeah.
He's like, I will never shut down a campus. Well, then he realized that this campus needed to be shut down for other campuses. Yeah, sometimes they shift and they change, but on what you're saying too, like focus on the strengths of your church. I had a conversation with a young youth pastor last week, and I was just trying to enforce with him, like, be you. Develop a culture that suits your strengths. Don't be afraid of your strengths and your weaknesses. Embrace your weaknesses and maybe not build a culture around your weaknesses. Like for me personally, I came from a broken home. I came from drug and alcohol addicted parent. Those are the kids that I relate to. Those are the kids that I'm reaching. That's the culture we embrace. Because that's who I am. And that's who I reach. So I would also say, establish a culture on your strengths. Don't be afraid of your
Yeah,
strengths.
that's
Embrace them.
great. Yeah,
And
that's
so
great.
that's good. We got a couple more questions that we'll get to. I'm going to go to Joe's first because it's the one that I first see and it's easy. What books do you recommend reading?
Yeah. Okay. I knew that was going to come up, and I was ready. I was like, okay, I wish I was more ready for this. Okay. So I'm going to have you recommend. So here's the truth. I'm actually doing graduate school work this summer. I'm going to be reading like every book there is to read on culture. However, which I'm like, really excited about because I'm like nerd level excited about that. Right. However, that's why right now I'm like not recommending any,
Yeah.
but I do recommend, I mean, you mentioned that you had read one, and Brian Eno had told me one, but growingleaders.com is Tim Elmore stuff. So
Yeah.
while Tim Elmore doesn't have a specific book on like, do this to create culture, he puts out free blog articles. I read his blog every single week, once or twice a week. And he addresses this type of stuff, even if it isn't as direct. Now, he does have some direct things, but really his whole thing is about establishing values in students and then changing cultures of your like school. So there isn't a specific book as much as I say almost all the things that I have learned, I've gleaned from him, other like blogs type too, but especially about culture, I've got from Tim Elmore's holistic resources and a lot of that from his blog. In regards to just a culture of family, Jeannie Mayo's the best on that. And so Secrets of Thriving Youth Groups in terms of the family aspect, that's where she's really strong. And so I became way more intentional about the family feel of our youth ministry after I read Jeannie's Thriving Youth Groups book.
Yeah, and Jeannie, like, she's always a go-to resource. Like,
yes.
Not bring her up. I'll just add, like, I've been listening to a lot of Craig Rochell's leadership podcast, and he talks all the time.
Yep.
I love Craig Rochell's leadership podcast a lot too because I can watch it on YouTube. I'm so visual that if I only have audio, I have no idea where my brain's gonna go. But if I have visual,
Craig Rochell does great talking about it. Yep.
He does a lot of this. I'll bring up Recalibrate Your Church by Troy Jones. We just did that cohort. He talks about the culture. He talks about the common language. He talks about your 5 things that you do really well. His church has 5 things that they do really well. And sometimes those 5 things change. And then lastly, this is kind of on the same topic, but Multipliers by Liz Wiseman. That one really talks to the leader about bringing out the genius in everyone else, which I think is a part of what we do as ministry leaders. And so those are both great. Multipliers, Paul, that book changed my life. I love that book. But
that's great.
Tasha had a comment. She said the Tim Elmore Habitude books are super cool. A great 2-page culture shift ideas, like be a thermostat, not a thermometer. I love that concept, especially.
And again, what we love about Tim Elmore's stuff is it gives language. So he provides great. I use the Habitudes language all the time, even if I wasn't using the Habitudes books, but it creates shared language. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Like anytime there's a breakout, anytime there's a conference, like what books, give me your top 3 books you're reading. It's good. Thanks for that question, Joe, because leaders are learners and learners are leaders. So any other questions or comments coming in? Tasha, great stuff there too. For Tim Elmore stuff. Small group Sunday school. Any other questions that you guys might have for Twyla today? I'll give you a minute to think about those. Unmute yourself if you feel like it's easier to just talk instead of type. Let's see here. Exciting. Okay. Awesome. Twyla, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise. Excited to have some of us joining you at camp this year and allow you to speak into the lives of our students there. Could you take a moment and just pray for our leaders? We've got children's and youth here. Just pray for them, if you would.
Yeah, it'd be my honor. Thank you so much for having me on this call. Father, I thank you for every church that's represented. God, we know that whether we're youth or kids, we're more than that. We're a part of your kingdom. and we're part of this local church that's called to have an impact on the culture of our communities. So we don't want to just be people who reflect the culture around us, but we actually want to create it even for our communities. And I pray that every leader on this call would have favor. They'd have favor with school principals and teachers and superintendents. They'd have favor with their neighbors as they seek to bring this culture of the kingdom into their communities. Holy Spirit, I pray that you would breathe life into all these leaders. I know as we wind down a school year, it can be exhausting and tiring, and kids have spring fever and all these things happening. But I pray that these leaders would be encouraged about what's already happening, that the DNA that's already in them is being infused into their students. So Holy Spirit, I pray this would be a great season of life and encouragement for them. And I just ask that you would give us wisdom as we try to take this and now implement it and say, how can we be more deliberate about this kingdom DNA that we want inside of our kids? Holy Spirit, speak to us individually and as our church staffs about what you'd have us do with this. In Jesus' name, amen.